morning. My name is Helen Christians, and I'd like to welcome you to the HGP, or Humanists of Greater Portland, Sunday morning meeting. We've just been entertained by Pete and Paul and Hank Robb for the half an hour, and they're going to come back on in just a moment. But just want to welcome you to today's meeting. Humanism, to just briefly define who we are. Humanism is a philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. Humanists, like the people gathered here this morning, attempt to live the best life we can envision because this is the only life of which we are certain. Humanism affirms the dignity of all people and the need to treat our fellow humans as our equals. Humanists value their fellow humans not only for all that they've accomplished in art, science, and humanity, but simply for their human potential. The Humanists of Greater Portland is a chapter of the American Humanists Association, and the American Humanists have developed a list of 10 commitments that are just a gentle guide of how to lead a life of humanism. Pete and Paul, will you be doing another song for us this morning?
Oh, sure.
Oh, wonderful. It's just brings such joy the first Sunday of every month just to hear you. It really, really, really does.
Well, as most of you know, Jimmy Buffett died this week. And this is the only one of his that we know.
Nibbling on sponge cake, watching the sun bathe. All of those tourists covered with oil, strumming my sixth string on my front porch swing. Smell those shrimp, they're beginning to boil. Wasting away again in Margaritaville, searching for my lost shaker of songs. Some people claim that there's a woman to blame, but I think it's nobody's fault. I don't know the reason I stayed here all season, with nothing to show but this brand new tattoo. But it's a real beauty, a Mexican cutie. How it got here, I haven't a clue. Wasting away again in Margaritaville, searching for my lost shaker of song. Some people claim that there's a woman to blame, but I think, hell, it could be my fault. Blew out my flip-flop, stepped on a pop-top, cut my heel, had to cruise on back home. But there's booze in the blender, and soon it will render that frozen concoction that helps me hang on. Wasting away again in Margaritaville, searching for my lost shaker of songs. Some people claim that there's a woman to blame, but I know it's my own damn fault. Some people claim that there's a woman to blame, but I know it's my own damn fault.
But thank you so much. That was just beautiful and a great tribute to a great guy that really, all us hardworking people would play that song and think, yeah, retirement is going to come. Retirement will happen. Now I'm ready to introduce our wonderful speaker today. I mean, not only did we have music, but we have the most popular speaker for our HGP programs. Dr. Jeff Seward has spoken to us over 30 times over the years, and he is a professor emeritus at Pacific University, where he taught for 32 years before retiring. He is the author of Politics of the Capitalist Transformation, Brazilian Informatics Policy, Regime Change, and State Autonomy.
Well, probably against my better judgment, some of the humanists from the program committee, Helen Christensen and Joyce Lackey, approached me and said, you know, some years ago, a political scientist came and gave like 4 lectures in a row, one every week, and it was great. Would you be interested in doing that? And loving as I do the sound of my own voice, I immediately agreed to a 6-part series. This is the first of a 6-part series. I'm not going to do them every week. I'm going to do them once a month, so you won't get tired of me quite as fast that way. On a variety of topics, and there's been some confusion about what the topics were because I didn't write them down and forgot them, and Helen helpfully sent along a partial list, which was actually sort of a preliminary list, that was not the one we quite agreed on. But as I reconstruct it, today is going to be political parties, necessity, or pathology. Then there's going to be one on thinking about inequality, one on the virtues and vices of markets, that may be more than we usually think of it, one on populism, its vices and possible virtues. The last one's going to be on non-utopian suggestions for reform. And there's another one in there that doesn't come to mind at the moment, but you'll see them as they unfold. But today, it's going to be political parties, pathology or necessity, okay? You know, one of the most common complaints about democracy that drives political scientists like me a little crazy is that democracy in general, or our democracy in particular, would be just great if it weren't for the pathological influence of political parties and politicians. This goes all the way back to our founding fathers, who wrote a constitution and tried to create new institutions for a nation at a time when political parties were just beginning to emerge, at least mass-based political parties. There were Tories and Whigs in England, but they weren't really mass-based parties because there wasn't a mass electorate in England. Only about 6 or 8% of the English population were allowed to vote back in the 18th century. It was really the mass-based political party that was created in the United States almost immediately after the founding fathers warned against them. The most famous denunciation probably is from Washington's farewell address, in which he said the following: "Let me now warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party. The common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. It serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another. In governments purely elective, it is a spirit not to be encouraged. Thomas Jefferson, another famous founding father, who most of you have probably heard of, who was also the founder, really, of the first modern mass-based political party, the Democratic Republicans that eventually turned into the Democratic Party. Despite that, and being one of the most partisan of the early founding fathers, those early elections were fiercely partisan between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Jefferson said, "I never submitted the whole system of my opinions to the creed of any party of men whatever, in religion, in philosophy, in politics, or in anything else, where I was capable of thinking for myself. Such an addiction is the last degradation of a free and moral agent. If I could not go to heaven but with a party, I would not go there at all." And yet he was one of the principal founders and leading politicians of what became the Democratic Party, and was himself fiercely partisan. The most eloquent denunciation of politicians, of the political class that I know of, was a description by Walt Whitman of a pre-Civil War Democratic Party convention. Here's Whitman's description of the members of this convention. The members who composed it were, 7/8 of them, the meanest kind of bawling and blowing office holders, office seekers, pimps, malignants, conspirators, murderers, fancy men, custom house clerks, contractors, kept editors, spaniels well trained to carry and fetch, jobbers, infidels, disunionists, terrorists, mail riflers, slave catchers, pushers of slavery, creatures of the president, creatures of would-be presidents, spies, bribers, compromisers, lobbyers, sponges, ruined sports, expelled gamblers, policy backers, Monte dealers, duelists, carriers of concealed weapons, deaf men, pimpled men, scarred inside with vile disease, gaudy outside with gold chains made from the people's money and harlots' money twisted together, crawling, serpentine men, the lousy combinings and born freedom sellers of the earth. Well, hard to stop that. In our more contemporary world, Walt Whitman, that was Walt Whitman. In our more contemporary world, this hostility to politicians and political parties takes several forms. One is expressed by that famous political scientist, Jesse Ventura, the ex-professional wrestler who served 2 terms as an independent governor of Minnesota. Jesse said, "I will not be a Democrat or a Republican. They are the problem, not the solution. We need to abolish political parties in this country." Short of abolishing parties altogether, many people pride themselves on being as Jefferson said, too independent and too intelligent and thoughtful to be captured by the propaganda of either major political party. So they insist on voting for the person and not the political party. Here's a quote from another famous political scientist, Kurt Schilling, all-star pitcher, famous for his support of Islamophobia and support for the January 6th insurrection. He says, "I don't vote party lines, never have. I vote for the best candidate." And you frequently hear people express this position. I want to insist today that it's a big mistake to see politicians and political parties as some sort of unfortunate pathological distortion of democracy. Instead, political scientists are virtually unanimous in seeing the politician and the political party as absolutely central features of any plausible form of representative democracy. I also want to persuade you that given that reality, no matter how independent you would like to be from any particular political party, and by all means be as independent as you want in your thought, you should always vote for a party and mostly ignore the qualities of the individual candidates, except in a party primary. Why are political parties and the professional politicians who lead them so central to democratic systems? Well, fundamentally, politicians and political parties are a necessity because we are too large a community and necessarily too ignorant to govern ourselves in a direct democracy. It is impossible to organize over 300 million people, or even 3 or 4 million people, to decide public policy democratically. How would you even begin to decide public policy democratically? How would you begin to organize a debate, deliberation, and vote for such a huge body of citizens for even a single issue? Some have suggested that we use modern technology. I found students thought this was very popular, and let everybody vote on everything via the internet. You know, every day you'd have 3 or 4 issues and you'd say yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. How would you allow all 300 million people a voice in the debate that preceded those internet votes? How would you organize the deliberation? Surely there would have to be a large amount of information distributed to everyone so that their deliberation and vote could be an informed one. Who would control the gathering and selection of that information in a fair, complete, and balanced way? How would you select that group that's going to filter the information for the deliberation of the citizenry? What if the decision involved not just a yes or no vote, but a choice among 3 or 4 or 5 alternatives? How would you go about doing the vote then? Political scientist, by the way, a famous political scientist named Kenneth Arrow, 60 or 70 years ago, demonstrated mathematically that if you have 3 choices in a democratic election, there is no fair and good way to make a decision. There are lots of ways you can do it, all of them flawed. Just to begin to think about how to make an internet voting system work for even a single issue boggles the mind. And there's not just one decision to make, but thousands, and many of them very technical. How many aircraft carriers should we have in the year 2030? Does anybody in the room know how many aircraft carriers we have today? Does a single person know? I don't happen to know. Should we develop a new generation of fighter planes, or bombers, or nuclear weapons? If so, which ones? What should be the level of permissible emissions of the hundreds or thousands of pollutants generated by our economy? What should the Federal Reserve's interest rate be? Do you feel competent to vote on any of that today, let alone on all of that and a zillion other things as well? How much information and study would you require before you were confident of your judgment on even a single item of that sort? Where would you find time for the rest of your life? So we necessarily live in a representative democracy, where we elect representatives to do that deliberation for us. What challenge does that present? How do we ensure that those representatives faithfully reflect our values and positions? Do we even want them to? What if there is a conflict between our local interests and the national interest? How do we want our local rep to vote in that case? The famous conservative Edmund Burke addressed this over 200 years ago when his constituents in Bristol wanted to force him to obey a list of instructions about how to vote in the next session of the Parliament on all the issues that they anticipated would come up. This used to be a fairly common practice, by the way, giving instructions to representatives before they went off to Parliament or Congress. Essentially, Burke said, how can you give me detailed instructions about how to vote if you aren't competent to make those decisions yourselves or to anticipate in advance all the issues and the changing circumstances around them. He said, your representative owes you not his industry only, but his judgment. And he betrays instead of serving you if he sacrifices his judgment to your opinion. He got defeated at the next election, by the way. But that's an important question. I like that. He betrays instead of serving you if he sacrifices his judgment to your opinion, to your uninformed opinion, especially. And he also addressed the problem of potential conflicts between local interests and national interests. Parliament is not a congress of ambassadors from different and hostile interests, which interests each must maintain as an agent and advocate against other agents and advocates. But Parliament is a deliberative assembly of one nation with one interest, that of the whole. You choose a member, indeed, but when you have chosen him, he is not a member of Bristol, but he is a member of Parliament. I actually incorporated this idea. I wrote the bylaws for the Faculty Senate at Pacific when we created it. And I wrote in, and people then later sort of said, this thing that's in there doesn't make sense. I said, you know, each member of the Senate should do his or her best to represent faithfully the interests of the group that sent you. In my case, I was a senator from the Social Sciences Division of the College of Arts and Sciences, while at the same time keeping in mind the overall interests of the university as a whole. And I remember somebody asking me, well, how are you supposed to do that? What if the one conflicts with the other? I said, that's the problem of being a representative of some particular group in a body that's supposed to look out for the interests of the whole. We condemn representatives for voting against the values of their constituents, right? That's not a good thing for a representative to do. We elected him, he should vote the way we feel, right? But we also condemn them for putting their wet fingers to the wind of public opinion polls to see which way the wind is blowing. Well, let's make up our mind. It is that reality that forces politicians to often appear slippery, ambiguous, even duplicitous. To be conscientious and effective, he or she must exercise thoughtful, independent judgment that may conflict with their constituents' views, while at the same time maintaining the appearance of being in strict accord with their constituents' opinions. That's the task of a successful and effective politician, and it inevitably leads to sort of fudging the truth, obscuring what you used to stand for compared to what you stand for now, et cetera, et cetera. John Stuart Mill, 1835, posed the problem of representative democracy in a slightly different way. This was his take. The grand difficulty in politics will for a long time be, Mill said, how best to conciliate the two great elements on which good government depends. One, to combine the greatest amount of the advantage derived from the independent judgment of a specially instructed few, the people who are actually making policy, with the greatest degree for the security for rectitude of purpose derived from rendering those few responsible to the many. So how do you combine giving power to responsible, effective, informed experts, and at the same time be sure that they don't just rule in their own interests, but are accountable to the broad public? I think that's a good statement of the problem. It's not a statement of the solution. Or in other words, how do we balance the expertise necessary for intelligent, constructive policymaking with a need to make those elite policymakers accountable to the public? But there's no way to enforce accountability through elections for every single policy, for every single decision. That's not what we vote on in elections, right? We get to vote up or down on a candidate, not up or down on every single decision that they make. Now, what tends to happen is if some particular issue becomes so salient, some people, abortion or gun rights or something, then people may be single-issue voters, right? And they'll hold candidates accountable for their vote on that one thing, on whether they think the election of 2020 was stolen or not, for example. But if you do that, then you're neglecting to hold them accountable for everything else that they did or believe. So that's a problem for the voter. You don't get to vote really on individual issues, you only get to vote for the candidate as a whole. This is where political parties come in. Even at that general level, it is very difficult for a voter to have enough information about each individual on a ballot to make an intelligent judgment about their performance. How many times have you had to fill out a ballot with dozens of candidates for offices you didn't even know existed and candidates about whom you knew next to nothing? So vote for the man, not for the party. I've got no clue what the board director of the water district does, let alone who those guys are who were weird enough to want to serve in that capacity. We are often told that we should vote for the individual and not for a party label, but there are two big problems with this apparently thoughtful suggestion. First, how do we gather enough information about all the individual candidates to make an intelligent judgment and not simply form a superficial impression based on negative political ads and superficial TV debates? I give you John Edwards, who became a highly popular candidate running for the presidency in whenever John Kerry was running, 2004, I guess. And then his whole candidacy exploded when his real character and real history came out, which we didn't know until some investigative reporters and so forth blew that up. We have a superficial understanding of the individuals that we run into contact with every day. Constantly surprise us when they reveal a brighter or a darker side than we ever imagined. Or the people who run the organizations in which we're involved, the schools or the workplaces and so forth. These public officials, we barely know them. Now, some that have been around for years and years, and we've seen them operate over and over, maybe we can get a better sense of them. But by and large, we have to vote on lots of individuals that we're in no position to make a intelligent decision about their character and qualities. Second problem is, it is political parties that really matter in determining the future of the country. Let's say you're a big admirer of a Mark Hatfield, which I was. I actually voted for him once because I was pissed off at the Democratic candidates, the only Republican I've ever voted for. Or Bob Packwood, before he was revealed to be a repulsive sexual predator. So you decide to vote for this moderate, thoughtful, experienced legislator for the House of Representatives. I know they were senators, but let's assume you're voting for the House of Representatives. But he's only one of 435 members. Only one of 220 or so members of his own party. And if you voted for this admiral Republican, you also just voted to have Kevin McCarthy as Speaker of the House, Jim Jordan as Chair of the Judiciary Committee, Marjorie Taylor Greene as a powerful and influential member of important committees. Because the House organizes itself by political party. And the party that's got the majority gets to decide the chairs of all the committees and to decide on the agenda and to block every initiative of a president who happens to be from the other party, unless they're bipartisan inclined, which current Republicans are not. In the Senate, you are giving Mitch McConnell the power to keep packing the Supreme Court and the entire federal judiciary with conservative extremists, in between him freezing up at press conferences. This is true even if your moderate, thoughtful Republican speaks out every day about the extremism of their colleagues. By voting for a Republican, you help give the Republican Party control of the Congress. By voting for a Democrat, you help give control to the Democrats. And that's what really matters. That's what's really going to shape the policy agenda of the country over the next few years. That's also why, even if you hate Joe Manchin, if you live in West Virginia and you want the Democrats to control the Congress, you better hold your nose and vote for Manchin, no matter how worthy his Republican opponent may seem. And you better not primary him with a more progressive Democrat who will lose in a landslide to the Republican in the fall, because you're voting for Mitch McConnell, if you do. In a large representative democracy, it is inevitable that something like political parties will arise to organize political decision-making. The Founding Fathers didn't see this because mass-based political parties for truly democratic elections were only just emerging, and they were not really fans of mass-based politics. That's why they created the Supreme Court, which is not elected, the Senate, which was not originally directly elected, the Electoral College, for Christ's sake, to indirectly let a group of notables elect the president. That's what they thought the Electoral College was going to do. You were going to elect thoughtful, intelligent people that you respected, and they would go off and make an independent choice. Never worked out like that from the beginning, but that's what they had in mind. But you need political parties in the Congress to prevent the chaotic decision-making of 535 strong-willed individuals all pulling in their separate directions. And you need them in elections to give cues to voters about who to vote for. We are certainly incompetent to vote on every single issue, and usually incompetent to vote on the individual qualities of dozens of different candidates. But we can have enough information and judgment to decide which of the major political parties we want to run the show. The alternatives are either a chaotic free-for-all or some undemocratic deference to an unelected elite. Elections in representative democracies can't decide every individual policy, but they can hold the major political parties broadly accountable by periodically throwing the bums out. This is not to say, though, that just because political parties are necessary and unavoidable, that they can't become pathological. The history of democracy is unfortunately full of pathological parties or pathological party systems. The Weimar Republic, before Hitler came to power, was crippled by the fact that in the last couple of years, two of the biggest parties in the Reichstag were the Nazis and the Communists, both of whom were intent on blowing up the representative democratic system, and together sort of collaborated in making it possible for Social Democrats and the Catholic Center Party to govern effectively from the center, because it was hard to come up with a working majority because you had these two extremist parties on either side corrupting the process, in effect. Israel today, partly because of the weird electoral system they have, well, it's not that weird, Israel has a pure proportional representation system. Whatever proportion of the total vote your party gets, that's the proportion of seats you get in the Knesset. As a result, no party in the history of Israel has ever had a majority by itself. So you have to put together a coalition. But by and large, the parties, there's been a couple of exceptions, but by and large, the parties in Israel don't want to put together a coalition with their main opposition party. That's who they were running against. So they put together a bunch of minor parties. Well, who are the minor parties? Most of them are extremist religious parties. The population of Israel is largely secular. They are not particularly observant Jews. But these small, ultra-Orthodox religious parties have forced onto the Israeli system all kinds of religious rules and regulations and restrictions, because neither the Labor Party in the past or the conservative parties in the recent history were able to govern without including them in the coalition. And the price that those parties demanded for coming into the coalition was, you've got to support ultra-Orthodox settlements in the occupied territories, or you've got to support Sabbath regulations that stores can't open on Saturdays, or whatever. Right now, Netanyahu, in his most recent coalition, gathered together the most extreme, far-right, nutcase, even criminal politicians to form his cabinet, because otherwise he couldn't stay in power and dodge the courts. Brazil has a weird electoral system that I'll talk about when I talk about elections later on, the effect of which is that they have like a dozen parties in their Congress. The last 5 elected presidents didn't have anything close to a majority in the Congress for their own party. In fact, their own party was a small minority. Well, how did they govern then? The other thing in Brazil is you elect all these people to the Congress, and then they look around to see which party is doing best, and they switch parties before the Congress opens. So you don't actually know what the shape of the Congress is going to be until all the politicians finish switching parties to some place that looks like a better place for them to run for Senate next time, or whatever. So how do people govern? They have to put the coalitions together, congressperson by congressperson. Well, how do you do that? You give them something. And so you get fairly regularized corruption, where presidents are in effect buying the votes of a sufficient coalition to rule. In the case of the Workers' Party, when Lula was in power before, he's the current president, but he was in power before, Lula has always been a very popular politician, but the Workers' Party has not been. So he had like 20 members of Congress out of 400. So what did he do? He recruited people who were willing to support his program, and he put them on a payroll. It was a month, they got a monthly check. Well, they didn't get a check because you could trace that. They got a monthly bunch of money in an envelope. It was called the mensalão, which is Portuguese for the monthly payment. And he had, like 150, 200 members of Congress on that. He didn't do it personally. His chief of staff was doing. His chief of staff went to prison for this. But Lula, of course, knew nothing about it, so he escaped. But that was just an extreme version of what every president in Brazil has had to do for decades, is to put together during the military government, they used to do it by handing out radio station licenses to congressmen, because you could get rich if you owned the local radio station, so they'd give out radio frequencies. Although political parties are a necessity, they can become pathological in one way or another. And I would say right now we have one pathological party in the United States. The Republican Party has become pathological and anti-democratic. It's an authoritarian party that would like to impose an authoritarian system on the United States if they had the power to do so. Right-wing populist parties in Europe are similar. The AfD in Germany, Alternatives für Deutschland, is now leading the Social Democratic Party, which is in power, is leading the Social Democratic Party in the polls, and is only like 5 points behind the Christian Democrats. And unfortunately, pathological parties can persist for a long time. In my opinion, the Republican Party of the United States was pathological for several decades before the arrival of Donald Trump. And its systematic assaults on the professional media, science, and professional expertise itself trained GOP voters to swallow the lies and bullshit of the Tea Party, Donald Trump, Tommy Tuberville, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, and Jim Jordan. Did you see what Tommy Tuberville said about the heat waves the other day? says, he's a former football coach from Alabama, right? He says, it was always hot in the summer when we did the preseason things. There's a technical scientific term for what's going on. It's called summer. Guy's a U.S. senator. Or the guys who bring a snowball into the Congress in the middle of the winter and say, see, no global warming here. As one political sage has said, all political parties die at last of swallowing their own lies. And the Republican Party is gorging itself on its own lies and purging anyone who's not willing to swallow them. As I say, pathological parties can persist for a long time. My favorite example is Argentina. Juan Perón and his wife Eva came to power in a pretty democratic election in 1946, and then got reelected in a not so democratic election 4 or 5 years later, and became increasingly authoritarian, were persecuting opponents and doing all kinds of bad stuff. They got overthrown by a military coup. And for the next 30 years or so, Argentina couldn't have a democratic election without the Peronists winning. And the army was unwilling to let the Peronists take power. So you'd have an election. Sometimes they'd ban the Peronist party from the elections, but then the elections wouldn't have any legitimacy since you were banning the party that would have gotten the most votes. Or some other party would run on the platform, if you elect us, we'll make the Peronists legal again. And then that wasn't acceptable. So they went back and forth. Eventually, they broke out of that cycle a little bit. But there is still, in Argentina, no normal political, center-left political party. There's no social democratic party, no socialist party of the sort that are common in Europe, because the Peronists have occupied that whole space. They're currently in power. The vice president, who some think is running the government, although I think it's an exaggeration, is a woman named Christina Kirchner, who was president before and who ran for vice president in part because she didn't want to go to jail. And if she was vice president, they couldn't prosecute her. She got to be a nutcase when she was president in various ways. But the Peronist Party is these days divided between people who are kind of normal left of center social democrats and wackos who still, would like to dig Juan and Eva up from the grave and put them in power. Italy, there's this lingering affection for Mussolini down to today. And assorted neo-fascist parties, sometimes with like great-granddaughter of Mussolini and so forth, who say, yeah, Mussolini, he had his problems, but he wasn't all bad. We could learn a lot from his regime. And there's currently a woman who's the head of a neo-fascist party, who's the premier of or prime minister of Italy. Once a cult-like pathology has formed in a major political party, they don't disappear easily. And their political support doesn't dissipate easily either. And the Trump phenomenon is evidence of that. I mean, it's amazing how well he's doing within the Republican Party, given all his problems. To my mind, the ideal for a well-functioning democracy is the alternation in power of a responsible center-left party capable of implementing needed reform through the expansion of government action, and a responsible center-right party capable of correcting the excesses and mistakes of the center-left party or coalition. This alternation is also an important device for keeping political corruption within tolerable limits. However, there is no guarantee that such a party system will in fact be in place. Britain had one between Labour and Conservatives for much of the post-war period. Germany had one between the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats for much of the post-war, that produced figures like Konrad Adenauer and Willy Brandt and so forth. The US had that for much of the 20th century, with the exception of the tyrannical one-party democratic rule in the segregated South. The country that is the best example of that today, to my mind, is Uruguay, who many of you have heard me talk about before. They had a very progressive government for 15 years that increased equality in Uruguay tremendously, greatly expanded membership of labor unions, created a labor union for rural workers, labor unions for domestic urban workers, and passed legalized abortion, LGBTQ rights, gay marriage, and marijuana. They lost the last election, and Uruguay is now governed by a responsible center party who has not rolled back or even tried to roll back a single one of those social reforms, nor have they felt it was politically a good idea to attack too directly any of the equality reforms. So they've created a consensus that's kind of like existed in the 1950s in the United States. Eisenhower famously said in the United States in the 50s, if any Republican wants to roll back Social Security and the New Deal reforms, that would be political suicide. He wasn't saying, gee, those were all great things. He was saying, we don't have any choice but to accept them. Well, this center-right party that's in power, coalition that's in party in Uruguay, is sort of in that position. They're doing conservative things. They're more fiscally conservative. They're beefing up police forces and public security. They're trying to create a major reform of the educational system, but they aren't challenging any of those major achievements of the progressive coalition that governed for 15 years. And so they've got a nice alternation between responsible center-left parties and responsible center-right parties, but it's a rarity in the world today. The solution for bad political parties is to reform the political parties, not abolish political parties. And the reform of political parties can only be done by voters punishing irresponsible parties over and over until they come to their senses, or until they lead the country into national disaster. That's what killed the Nazis, fine, and Mussolini as well. I'd rather not wait for the Republicans to create a national disaster, a nuclear war or something. But far from happening to the Republican Party of the United States, instead, they've been largely rewarded by voters for their extremism. They now control the Supreme Court, they control the House, they almost control the Senate, and may after the next election. Donald Trump is running more or less even Steven with Joe Biden for the presidency. So that's not happening at the moment because they're not losing. I mean, they aren't winning as much as they might, but they aren't losing. But the answer also shouldn't be about weakening political parties because there is no good alternative. What have we done to weaken political parties? Money in politics has greatly weakened political parties because it doesn't go through the parties. Instead, it empowers special interests and extremists, not political parties. There was a very interesting article, I don't know if any of you saw this, in the New York Times last week by Thomas Edsall, who's great. If you don't know Thomas Edsall, anytime you see a column by his in the New York Times, read it. They're long and complicated, but what they're usually full of is quotations from political scientists and their most recent research, often not yet published, about important issues. And this was about the impact of small donors. There's been an explosion of small donors, and we usually think that's great. Small donors, that's more democratic than having these big rich guys fund everything. Except that it's not everybody that's making small donations. And it turns out most small donors are extremist compared to the mainstream of their parties. And so the growth of small donors is pulling people to the extreme as much as the Koch brothers or people like that are with the big money. Another problem is our campaign structure, where we permit billions of dollars to be spent on completely uninformative negative ads. No other countries have that. Britain doesn't have that. European countries don't have that. They all have different systems, but nobody allows the campaign primarily to be about dueling 30-second ads trashing your opponent. Why do they do that? Because they're effective. They work. Everybody says they hate them, and everybody gets those images in their mind. And they shape people's 5-word description of what a candidate is about. Lately, there's been a lot of talk. It's bad to have closed primaries where only Democrats get to vote in the Democratic primary. We ought to open those up and let everybody vote. I'm open to that if you let independents vote. But Republicans shouldn't be voting in the Democratic primary, and Democrats shouldn't be voting in the Republican primary. My liberal younger brother, who was a lawyer in Seattle, has retired to northern Idaho, which is now in the grip of ultra-extreme right-wing Republicans. And so he dropped his Democratic Party registration and registered as a Republican because the only action is in the Republican primary. Well, he's not alone. Well, the Republican Party has reacted by saying, you're not allowed to vote in a Republican primary if, I can't remember what they're specific, but they're like, if you voted Democratic in the last election, or if you've contributed recently to a Democratic candidate, then you're going to be outlawed from participating in the Republican primary. If we want political parties to shape the political discourse, we have to allow them to choose their own candidates so that we then get a debate between a center-left alternative and a center-right alternative. There are almost as many independents now as those who say they're Democrats or Republicans. So it makes sense to me to say, okay, let independents vote. But they can't vote in both. You know, you got to pick. You're going to vote Democrats, you're going to vote Republican. But don't let Republicans vote in Democratic primaries, and don't let Democrats vote in Republican primaries. The other thing that's becoming popular are these all-party primaries, where all the candidates run at once, and whoever are the top 2 candidates are the general election candidates. Well, if you've got a one-party dominant state, that means that every election, the 2 candidates running in the fall are Republicans or are Democrats, which means that the opposing party never gets a chance to put its program or its candidates in front of the larger electorate of the fall elections. I think that's a terrible idea. It doesn't always work out that way, but it very often works out that way. You end up with 2 Republicans or 2 Democrats in the fall election. And that greatly weakens parties. I think it's a bad idea. For the same, we also don't want a politics dominated by individuals who make a splash as celebrities. Then we're back to, it's ridiculous that, what is his name? Vitek Ramaswamy, suddenly surging in Republican polls a little bit because he's flashy on TV, and he's a moron. He's a very smart moron, but, he says all kinds of really stupid things, but they don't matter because he's young and he's handsome and he's articulate and he's dynamic on the stage. And so who wouldn't want him instead of Mike Pence? If we're simply electing celebrities, this is like the worst of all possible outcomes. In Brazil, in their system, it benefits you if you put a bunch of people on your ticket who are big vote getters, because how many people your ticket elects depends on the total vote of all your candidates. So when I lived there in the 80s, one party just stuffed their whole ticket with rock stars and famous athletes and so forth like that, who'd get a bunch of votes by name recognition to elect the politicians at the top of the ticket for their party. That doesn't make sense. So we got to have parties. What to do about pathological parties? I'm afraid it's sort of grin and bear it until they start getting beat or they lead to some kind of disaster, unfortunately. My suggestions for reform would be to greatly reduce the influence of money in politics, and to channel what money there is in politics through the political parties, including secondary political parties, and also restrict political advertising. One reform I would suggest is you can put paid political ads on, but they have to be at least 3 minutes long, and they can consist only of your candidate speaking directly to the camera, expounding their position, their ideology, whatever. no morning in America kinds of ads and no trashing the opponents. Give the candidates an opportunity to speak, but don't give them an opportunity to get consultants who construct manipulative paid propaganda. So those are the only suggestions I have for improving the political parties in countries like ours. My recommendation to individuals is to move to Uruguay. That's it.
It really gave me a lot to think about as far as, just that whole idea of supporting your party. But so it looks like we have a question at Friendly House. Come on in.
Thanks for a great talk.
Thank you.
I was wondering, do you have any feelings about, as you say, minor political parties? Like, what would it be better if, say, the U.S., rather than having two major political parties and others that had, say, 3 or 4? Whether are coalitions always bad for governments?
It might be better, but be careful what you wish for. Example, I like the electoral system of Germany. They elect half of their representatives in districts like we do, and half through proportional representation. And because of they don't want the rise of another Nazi party, you have to get at least 5% of the vote in order to get any representation. So you can't just be a tiny little party. But despite that, the AfD has managed to, they're up to like 20% in the polls. And you don't want that kind of a third party. A reform that I like is to say, nobody can contribute their own money to political campaigns. Just wipe out the whole campaign contribution thing. Give everybody, every voter, and let's have universal voting registration, and then give every voter a $200 voucher that they can contribute to any political party that they want. And if they want to contribute to the Green Party or the American Constitutional Party, so be it. Most people would contribute to the Democrat and Republican Party, but it's a huge pot of money, and you couldn't use the money for anything else. So that would democratize, and that would get around the problem of small donors are more extreme than the general electorate, because the general electorate would also be contributing money, and that would give minor parties a way in. I was on the ballot in 1972 as an elector candidate for Benjamin Spock for the People's Party of Idaho. And so I'm sensitive to the problem of third parties. I got 800 votes, which was almost 1% of the electorate.
Well done. Okay, we have a question from the Zoom audience. Ringa, come on in. It's so glad you can join us. I know you're not here in Portland right now, so please come on in and
okay. I'm in Atlanta now.
Atlanta, good.
Yeah, I have a question regarding the primaries. I know that primaries allow a sort of democratic way to decide the candidates who will contest. But there is also a downside to that, namely that any small organized group with enough money power can either boost a candidate or sort of get a candidate out. And that is happening increasingly in recent years. Do you have any suggestions how we can reform this primary system?
Yeah. There's a sense in which primaries, which were designed to make the system more democratic, have made it less so. Because participation in primaries is so low. It's even worse in caucuses. The caucus participation is trivial, and much more extreme candidates show up at those. I personally am in favor of mandatory voting, and I would extend that to primaries. That you have to vote, and if you don't vote, you pay a little fine or you become ineligible for some minor interesting social benefit. Quite a few countries have mandatory voting. As a result, they get much higher voter participation. And you could do the same thing for primaries, because a primary tends to get less than half of the votes that the general election does, and it tends to be more extreme voters. And I would abolish caucuses altogether. Caucuses are the most undemocratic feature of our supposedly democratic system.
We have a question from Friendly House. Come on in. Oh, it's Dakota. Come on in.
Good morning, all.
Mhm.
Hello, Dakota.
Hello, my name is. So I have a question about the reform within the political party, because you mentioned that that's the only way to basically prevent it from falling into a sort of tribalistic
Pathology, yeah.
pathology. My question is, if that's the way to do it, just like you would want, we would have like the representatives elected because they're the wisest and most deliberate about which way that should go. How do you have the party as a whole? How do you make sure that the party as a whole is moving in the right direction if you're always relying on that pathology to go anywhere?
The way you do it is by defeating them, election after election after election. Parties do change when they lose, because that's their primary goal, is to win elections. And parties have fallen apart. The two parties before the Civil War were the Whig Party and the Democratic Party, and the Whig Party disintegrated over internal disputes, and out of it emerged the Republican Party. So it can happen, but people have been saying, well, don't vote for Donald Trump because he's a loser, because he lost the 2020 election. Well, Republican voters don't believe he lost the 2020 election, so that's a worthless argument for them. We think he was a winner. It's just that the damn Democrats stole the election. And so, I mean, if you create this entire false narrative around how your party is doing, or people say, well, Donald Trump's a sure loser in the fall with all these indictments and so forth. Republican voters don't believe that. They think he's their best shot at defeating Joe Biden. And so it doesn't make sense for them to abandon their best candidate for Nikki Haley or Ron and so forth. So it can only come from the general electorate punishing parties for losing touch with reality. And so far, there's no sign that the American electorate is ready to do that with the Republican Party,
And that,
especially in the South.
that means by extension too, that it's never going to happen from the inside then. of that
Well,
party.
not in any short-term way. But I don't know how you do it from the outside. I mean, through an authoritarian intervention where you say the Republican Party is now illegal, and anybody who voted for Donald Trump is ineligible to vote for the next 10 years, and we're going to organize a new and better Republican. But that it's hard to come up with a way to intervene in the internal affairs of a party that isn't highly undemocratic.
Sorry.
I do want to make a comment that the last two questioners, both Renge and Dakota, did a beautiful job. They had a short little comment and then a question. And so those are two really good examples of how this program works. So let's get our next questioner here at Friendly House, questioner number 3. Come on up.
I'm wondering what you would suggest for the lack of access to state representatives. I have a bill that I've been told would be carried next session, but it's a short session and we could get bumped. And it is to provide for children coming out of extreme religions. So something HDP would love. But anyway, the fact that they can only take 2 or 3 this session, because
Is it a special session?
I know I was told it was a short session and we could get bumped.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking, what can we do about that?
Well, this is what the initiative process was designed for. That if you have an issue that you think is important, you think it might get broad support from the public, and the legislature just doesn't want to deal with it, and you gather the signatures and you put it on the ballot. And legislatures, not always, but mostly, tend to highly respect things that got passed by the public in a referendum, in an initiative. There's also the referendum where the legislature itself puts something on the ballot, but that wouldn't help you because they're not being responsive. So, well, of course they've told you they will because they want your vote, but that doesn't mean that they will. They tell that to all the girls. that they want to, but then they don't. No, you've got to force their hand. Franklin Roosevelt told some people once, and I think it was a civil rights group, but I'm not sure. It was some group came to him and said, you know, we want this thing done. We want you to support this. This is a good thing. We know you agree with us. So why won't you support this? And Roosevelt said, yeah, I do agree with you. I think that'd be great. But right now, it would be political suicide. So you have to go out there and mobilize people and force me to do it. And I will be happy to be forced to do it, but I can't do it from here. And so, I mean, that's the other thing about a healthy democracy is not only does it have a responsible center left and a responsible center right party, but it has strong social movements that put pressure on the parties to be responsive to new groups, new forms of new people demanding rights that they haven't been given before and so forth. And so you see a lot. I mean, without the civil rights movement, we never would have gotten the civil rights laws. Without the women's movement and the gay rights movement, we never would have gotten progress on those issues because conventional politicians were scared of them. Even in the last year or two of Obama's administration, he was afraid to come out for gay marriage. Although I'm sure in his heart of hearts, he thought that was a good idea. And Joe Biden eventually sort of forced him into it. He came out for it, and then Obama was sort of embarrassed into it. Turned out, you know, it's been highly popular. Even a majority of Republicans now support gay marriage. But it was social movements that did that. And they're the best way to break up a paralysis of a legislature.
We have our next question here at Friendly House. Please come in.
Good morning, Warren Darris. 50 years ago, I litigated and won the first appellate court decision in the country.
First what decision?
The first appellate court decision in the country, ruling that campaign spending limits violate free speech rights.
Right.
It seems to me that your solutions to the problems you perceive with the political party are utterly inconsistent with the free speech rights on which our political system is based. I'd appreciate your comments.
I'm all in favor of expanding political speech and expanding political speech on mass media. I'm just not in favor of purchased political propaganda being 95% of our total political discourse. I want more debates, although I don't want these crappy debates that we have. I'm not quite sure what format for debates one should have, but what we've deteriorated into, and this is explicit. Pacific used to have a thing called the McCall Forum, where we would invite prominent conservatives and liberals out. And one year we had Ralph Reed, the head of the Christian Coalition, the executive secretary of something out. And I chauffeured him around for a couple of days during the event. And he had been part of prepping George W. Bush for the debate against Al Gore in 2000. And he said, you know, what we did is we finally realized the stupidest thing that you can do is answer the questions that are asked. Whatever you do, don't answer the questions that are asked. Take something in that question and turn it into a way that you can deliver one of your 6 talking points that you've decided you're getting through in the debate. And he said, and so we had this first debate, and Al Gore conscientiously answered all the questions, and George Bush pushed his talking points, and he, in effect, won the debates. But that's what the debates have been reduced to. Nobody answers a question. They all just say, well, how can I turn that question into one of my pre-selected talking points? And then it's gone. When I went to live in Brazil in the 80s, I'd turn on the political talk shows there, and it was amazing. They'd have a bunch of politicians around, and they'd ask them a question, and they'd let the guy talk for 10 minutes without interruption. And you learn 2 things from that. One, that the guy was actually capable of talking for 10 minutes instead of only for 30 seconds. And you got a chance for him to really expound, you know, a substantial viewpoint about things. On our news programs back in the 60s, when network television would interview a politician in the context of a news story about the campaign, they would let a candidate talk for 45 seconds, a minute. Now you get 5 to 10 seconds. You get a sound bite, that's all, because they've learned that audiences like shorter, punchier kinds of things. And so in the name of free speech, we have completely occupied the arena of public discourse with what I would call almost non-speech, non-discourse, non-real exposition of ideas or engagement of ideas. And we need to invent other ways of giving everybody, including those who don't have any money, access to public discourse in a way where they're actually required to say something and defend something instead of just blathering. And I'm not quite sure exactly how to do that, but I'm sure that paid political advertising is not the way.
We have a question from Friendly House. Come on in now.
Yes, you mentioned name recognition, and I think this is a real big problem. And it leads to either a system of nepotism where political families become very powerful, or it leads to what we have now, I guess, in the Democratic Party, where you have to run the same candidates again if they don't have any kids. And we got a guy up around 80 running for president. And I think it has to do with the name recognition thing, but we've got to find some way to unclog that to where younger people can get into the system somehow. We talked about this here.
What's your question?
Right. My idea is that we should have vice presidential primaries to let
what's your question?
newcomers come in. Will that work, or what else would you do
Well,
instead of that?
What to do is require all the candidates to change their name before they run, so that you've never heard of them before.
Yeah, you should kind of like a fiddle contest where you don't know who the contestants are when you listen to it.
Question.
No, it's a name recognition is dominant. It's really enormous. And I don't really know any way around that. The one good thing about it is that the people with the most name recognition within the class of politicians are people who have been around for a long time. And so you actually have a pretty good idea of what they stand for. You know their history. You know that Joe Biden got driven out of his first presidential campaign because of plagiarism of a Labour Party speech from Britain, et cetera, et cetera. And you know what he stood for in the Congress. You know that he ran the Anita Hill hearings in a bad way. You know that he sponsored the Violence Against Women Act. You know, you've got this long record. So it's not exactly just name recognition. It's also familiarity with this person where you feel like, well, I know who Joe Biden is pretty well. I think we have a very good idea of who Donald Trump is now. We don't have a very good idea of who Asa Hutchinson is, or who even Ron Sanctimonious is. So I don't know. That's a problem. But it goes back to the problem of celebrities dominating the process instead of political parties. I also think that long ago, before primaries and caucuses, party bosses got in a smoke-filled room and chose a candidate. In some ways, that was a better system. I don't really want to advocate going back to that, but they selected people like, Eisenhower and Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt and Adlai Stevenson, and there were some good candidates. In 1968, and this system changed rapidly. In 1968, Hubert Humphrey was the Democratic nominee. He didn't win a single primary because he didn't enter a single primary. There was only a handful of primaries. John F. Kennedy had used them in 1960 to demonstrate that people would vote for a Catholic, but they weren't what got him the nomination in terms of number of delegates. So Hubert Humphrey got delegates from all these processes by which party organizations chose the delegates. That was a bad outcome, I think, because I would have liked to have seen Robert Kennedy or Eugene McCarthy be the nominee, and it was sort of weird for someone who didn't even run in any of the primaries to be the nominee. But the name recognition thing is the name recognition and money is a big thing. Years ago, when who's our senator, our junior senator?
Merkley.
Yeah, when he first ran against the Republican, or maybe the Republican had retired. I don't know. I thought about running for the Senate that year.
Oh.
Because I've got a big ego. And I saw Merkley and two other Democratic candidates do a debate at Pacific University, and they were all terrible. They were just pitiful. I thought, I can do better than that. And I thought about it, but as I thought about it, I thought, well, my name recognition is 0. And I don't want to lift a finger to raise any money. And so what am I thinking? I can't run just because I'm smart and articulate and I'm a political scientist who ought to know something. The obstacles to being a candidate for major office have become too high. And the name recognition is one obstacle, the raising the money. We have a money primary. In Iran, they have sort of a theocratic primary. They actually have competitive elections in Iran. But to qualify for the election, you have to pass through an examination of the mullahs.
Oh.
And they decide whether you're sufficiently religiously orthodox to be an okay candidate. They still get candidates with divergent views, and the theocracy's candidate doesn't always win among those, but a lot of people are ruled out because they didn't pass the theocratic primary. In the United States, we have a money primary. You've got to get through the money primary. And if you can't get the approval of enough people who like to contribute to campaigns, then you can't run for high public office unless you have a celebrity that you can get on the internet and raise zillions of dollars through small donations. But that's a restricted number of people too. And it depends on name recognition also.
Okay. We have our final question from Hank Robb.
It didn't seem to me that Franklin Roosevelt had that great of morality when it came to not fooling around on his wife. Seems similarly to be the case for Dwight Eisenhower, and we could name some others. But when Gary Hart ran, at least in my experience, that's when the idea that one's personal morality, especially one's sexual morality, is a very good gauge for determining whether or not someone would do well in making policy. Do you have any thoughts about the distinction between one's personal, especially sexual morality, and their ability to make policy?
Well, I approve of the notion that character is an important qualification for office, but our understanding of what constitutes character has changed. And it became that, you shouldn't have been fooling around sexually and cheating on your wife. I mean, this used to be par for the course among powerful men. If you disqualified every man who fooled around from high public office, why it would only be women in office. Some of you may think that'd be a good idea, but Kennedy was awful. Our understanding of what constitutes good character has changed. It didn't used to be a big deal if men fooled around, and now it is for people in the public eye. And that reflects greater respect for the rights of women and respect for women, and that's a good thing. So in that sense, I think it's completely irrelevant. It doesn't seem to matter anymore, though. I mean, who has been less faithful to his wife than Donald Trump? And yet he's overwhelmingly the choice of all the Christian conservatives who used to insist that character was the #1 qualification for a president, and that's why Bill Clinton should resign or be impeached. And now suddenly it doesn't matter if you can put anti-Roe v. Wade people on the Supreme Court. We don't care if you lie, cheat, steal, fool around, or whatever. I mean, Donald Trump has got to be the most immoral candidate for high office in the history of the United States. I mean, he cheats and lies about everything, and it's well documented, and it doesn't matter. So I do think it's a mistake for reporters to spend more time searching into the sexual history of candidates than their political histories. But in the event of some clear scandal, I think it does tell us something. I mean, it used to be worse. Nelson Rockefeller never became president in large measure because he got a divorce. He might well have been the nominee in 1964, 68, if he hadn't gotten divorced. Now, he later died from a heart attack in the bed of another mistress that he was cheating with his second wife. But so a story about heart. When I was at Stanford getting my Ph.D., I was a teaching assistant for Condoleezza Rice, who was just starting out at Stanford. It was like her first or second year there. And at the time, she was a Democrat. And she told me once her ambition was to be the first woman Secretary of Defense. She almost made it. She got Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. But she and some other professors at Stanford were working on new innovative defense policies for Gary Hart. And their idea is we're going to be the defense intellectual brain trust behind Gary Hart. And then this was before all of this, this was before 1984 when he ran the first time. And when he gets elected, we'll all go get big jobs in the intelligence and defense establishment. And then his candidacy imploded and she found better opportunities in the Republican Party.
Well, I think we've run out of time, Jeff. This was absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gave us a lot to think about.